In October 1978, a brutal war broke out between the nations of Uganda and Tanzania. This war, commonly referred to as the Kagera War or the Uganda-Tanzania War of 1978 to 1979, was a landmark event in postcolonial East African history. Rooted in a deep rivalry between Idi Amin of Uganda and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, the conflict provoked bitter exchanges at the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, contributed to the failure of Tanzania's economy, and brought an end to 8 years of Idi Amin's brutal dictatorship in Uganda. To many, Idi Amin's end was incomprehensibly anticlimactic. He was a tyrant who had smashed even a murmur of protest with brute force. Now, this very dictator, who had flaunted his military prowess, had simply melted away as this Uganda-Tanzania war went on. In this episode of African Biographics, we cover the story of the Uganda-Tanzania War and the events leading to the demise of Idi Amin Dada, the former despotic ruler of Uganda. The origins of the war between Uganda and Tanzania, as well as the eventual demise of Idi Amin, actually lie in the coup d'etat that brought General Amin to power in January of 1971. In this instance, Idi Amin's forces overthrew the then president of Uganda, Apollo Obote, while he was on a visit to Singapore to attend a Commonwealth conference. Julius Nyerere, who at the time was the president of neighboring Tanzania, had enjoyed close relations with the now deposed Obote, having backed his socialist move to the left policies. So Julius Nyerere refused to recognize the new regime in Kampala and offered Obote and many of his supporters exile in Tanzania. So after his overthrow, Obote came to Dar es Salaam, where the Tanzanian government continued to treat him like a head of state. He was given a stipend, a seafront house dubbed State House No. 2, and round-the-clock security protection. In return, the Tanzanians asked only that he keep a low public profile. For his part, at his very first public meeting after the takeover, Idi Amin countered that Julius Nyerere was conspiring to invade Uganda and restore the fallen president to power. The Tanzanian boogie thus became the military regime's constant cry whenever it faced any internal crisis in Uganda. All of this contributed to the bitter rivalry that formed between the two presidents, Nyerere and Amin. This was not helped by the fact that in September of 1972, around 1,000 armed supporters of Obote crossed into southern Uganda from northwestern Tanzania and advanced on Kampala to wage war on Idi Amin. This group had the tacit support of Julius Nyerere. The mission by these exiles failed dismally, and Idi Amin responded to the attack by bombing Tanzanian towns near the border. Julius Nyerere was encouraged by his generals to respond to Amin and Uganda in the same vein, but he instead preferred to settle the conflict via a settlement. And so on 5 October 1972, Tanzania and Uganda signed the 5-point Mogadishu Agreement, in which both agreed to withdraw troops to 10 kilometers behind the border and cease to support forces hostile to each other's regime. Nonetheless, relations remained tense between the two presidents. Nyerere regularly criticized Idi Amin's government, and Amin made continuous threats to invade Tanzania. At the same time, Uganda also contested its border with Tanzania, asserting that the Kagera salient, a 1,900 square kilometer stretch of land between the official boundary and the Kagera River, 29 kilometers to the south, should be under its control, stressing that the Kagera River was a more logical boundary. A few years down the line, Idi Amin would try to annex the Kagera salient, and this would mark the beginning of trouble in the region. But more on this later. It is also worth mentioning that the situation in Idi Amin's Uganda was also chaotic, to say the least. While Idi Amin's ascension had come with promises of promoting welfare and stabilizing the region by dismantling Obote's despotic instruments, he implemented separatist strategies immediately after seizing power in 1971. One of his first acts in office was the disarmament of the Acholi and Langi soldiers in the Ugandan army, with subsequent ethnic killings a few years later. Terror became the order of the day in Uganda. Amin's opponents disappeared or were summarily executed, though the regime always denied responsibility. Even occupying an office in government offered no security. 6 of the 56 cabinet ministers under Amin were killed while in office or soon after dismissal. The number of Ugandans killed under Amin is impossible to estimate and varies from source to source. Amnesty International claimed that it was as high as 300,000. While Idi Amin's government was not necessarily responsible for every death, the prevailing anarchic conditions in Uganda provided cover for ethnic massacres and the settlement of private scores amongst people there. Idi Amin also declared an economic war that saw the expulsion of thousands of the Asian minority living in Uganda in 1972, and their ventures were placed under the management of Africans. The consequences of the reform were disastrous for Uganda's economy. The immediate impact was the scarcity of basic consumer goods such as bread, butter, milk, sugar, and salt. Those in positions of economic power also created artificial shortages and later sold the items under a black market system popularly known as magendo. The introduction of an American trade boycott in October of 1978 on account of Idi Amin's human rights record cut Uganda off from the largest market for its key coffee export, a problem that was exacerbated by a coinciding global slump in coffee prices. The spoils of the economic war that was waged by Idi Amin were allotted to military officers and leading politicians who became known as mafuta mingi, meaning dripping in cooking oil, which was a rare and expensive commodity amid the ongoing economic chaos. The beneficiaries of Idi Amin's policies also reflected his ethnic and religious background. The army recruited heavily from the president's own West Nile region, together with large numbers of Muslim Southern Sudanese and Nubian troops. Idi Amin's regime also concentrated power in the armed forces. As of 1978, 64% of cabinet portfolios were held by members of the police, army, or prison service. During his time in power, Idi Amin survived many assassination attempts, and this made him increasingly mistrustful and regularly purged the senior ranks of the Ugandan armed forces. Amin had become increasingly uncompromising towards any sign of dissent. In February of 1977, Idi Amin caused outrage around the world when the Archbishop Janani Luwum was murdered, with the regime disguising it as a car accident. This was following allegations that the Archbishop was plotting with Milton Obote, and this also came days after the Archbishop had openly criticized Idi Amin. By 1978, political tensions in Uganda were running very high. A feud began between Idi Amin and his vice president, Brigadier General Mustafa Adrisi, who had built up his own power base within the army. In April of 1978, a dispute within the government was immediately followed by another car accident in which Mustafa Adrisi was seriously injured. On 8 October of the same year, Idi Amin narrowly survived a coup attempt. His support base, which he deliberately kept narrow in order to secure loyalty, had disintegrated in the face of an economic collapse that dried up the vital patronage channels to the military. Fearing for his safety and having less confidence in his influential abilities to quell the growing tension, Idi Amin started to withdraw from the public sphere and made fewer visits with his troops. Around the same time, he started accusing Tanzania of violating his country's border and sovereignty. It is alleged that in order to divert attention from the ongoing political and economic crisis that engulfed Uganda, Amin ordered an invasion of Tanzania in October of 1978, allegedly because the latter planned to overthrow his government. For his part, as I already alluded to, Idi Amin made routine threats to invade Tanzania, often with the intention of distracting attention from the growing strife at home. This culminated in the Kagera War, also known as the Uganda-Tanzania War. The war started in October of 1978, with many Ugandan assaults across the border leading to the invasion of the Kagera salient. The events surrounding the breakout of the war are unclear, and there are various accounts of the events. Many soldiers of the Ugandan army blamed one Lieutenant Colonel Butabika for starting the war. Butabika was accused of concocting an incident at the border to have an excuse for attacking Tanzania. Many other officers of the Ugandan army offered more ordinary explanations for the Kagera War, which claimed that isolated clashes along the border culminated in a series of violence that led to open warfare. A few incidents pinpointed as probable start points of the conflict are cases of tribal tensions, cattle rustling, a bar fight between a Ugandan military officer and Tanzanian soldiers or civilians, as well as a fight between a Tanzanian woman and a Ugandan woman in a market. Many Ugandan soldiers who affirmed the bar fight theory agreed that the incident happened on the 9th of October on the premises of a Tanzanian business. They also agreed that after Lieutenant Colonel Butabika was told about the brawl, he unilaterally commanded his unit, the Suicide Battalion, to exact revenge by attacking Tanzania, thus resulting in the Kagera War. According to the Ugandan soldiers, Idi Amin was not informed of the decision to wage war on Tanzania until much later and only went along with it in order to save face. The Ugandan invasion caught Tanzania by surprise and its army completely off guard. In compliance with the Mogadishu Agreement of 1972, Tanzanian troop deployment in the border area had been minimal, and this allowed Ugandan soldiers to advance as far as the Kagera River by the town Kiaka without meeting much resistance. The Ugandan army blew up the river's only bridge, and on the 1st of November 1978, Idi Amin announced the annexation of the Kagera salient. The Ugandan invasion evoked international condemnation. The near-universal condemnation of his invasion is believed to have taken Idi Amin by surprise, and faced with international pressure and full Tanzanian mobilization, Idi Amin announced the withdrawal of his forces on 14 November 1978. But Tanzania refused to acknowledge that Uganda had in fact withdrawn, claiming instead that fighting was ongoing and that its army was still expelling Ugandan troops from Tanzania. Although no formal peace was announced, the conflict was commonly believed to be over by December 1978. So Tanzania's invasion of Uganda on 21 January 1979 therefore took the world by surprise. As Uganda had the higher ground on the former Uganda-Tanzanian border and had previously exploited this advantage to launch numerous attacks on Tanzania, it has been suggested that the Tanzanian invasion was motivated primarily by a desire to push on to a more easily defensible point on the Ugandan side of the border. However, the most commonly believed explanation of the Tanzanian invasion is that Tanzania wanted to destabilize the regime of Idi Amin. Idi Amin's response to the invasion by Tanzania was to appeal to the United Nations Secretary General to prevail on Tanzania to withdraw from Uganda peacefully. On 12 February 1979, Idi Amin made claims that Tanzanian forces were, with the support of mercenaries, in occupation of about 900 square kilometers of Ugandan territory and formally called for an immediate meeting of the United Nations Security Council. However, Tanzania simply denied the presence of its troops beyond the immediate border area. When pressed further, Tanzanian diplomats repeated President Julius Nyerere's insistence that Tanzania does not desire an inch of Ugandan territory. While all of this was taking place, Julius Nyerere originally hoped that a combination of an invasion led by the Ugandan dissident forces and a popular internal uprising would be enough to finish off the regime of Idi Amin. He recognized that a Tanzanian counter-invasion of Uganda would be diplomatically unacceptable to other African states. With this in mind, Nyerere therefore developed a justification of the counter-invasion, with one being that the Tanzanian defense forces were fighting to ensure national security of Tanzania and that the Ugandan dissidents were fighting to liberate Uganda from Idi Amin. However, the Ugandan dissidents were too weak to fulfill the role Julius Nyerere had envisioned for them. The reaction of the OAU to the resumption of hostilities between the two countries was to convene an ad hoc mediation committee which met on the 21st of February 1979 in Nairobi in advance of the scheduled Council of Ministers conference due to open 2 days later. This mediation committee failed dismally. Neither the Tanzanian nor the Ugandan delegation was prepared to compromise on their basic principles. Tanzania demanded that the OAU condemn the initial Ugandan invasion and order Idi Amin to pay reparations for the wanton destruction of the Kagera salient. Julius Nyerere later reiterated in a radio broadcast on 20th February that Tanzania would remain with the only option of taking whatever steps she thought proper in defending herself and punishing the criminal, in this case being Idi Amin. Meanwhile, Idi Amin's Arab and communist friends had refused to support him during his 1978 invasion of Tanzania. But anyways, the Tanzanian invasion of Uganda provoked Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, who was Idi Amin's close ally, into action. By mid-February 1979, Libyan troops and war supplies started arriving in Uganda. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, also sent several fighters to help Idi Amin. But the Ugandan army was disintegrating, leaving Libyan troops to do most of the heavy lifting. By March of 1979, Muammar Gaddafi realized that Amin's regime could no longer effectively defend itself, and so he started pulling his troops out of Uganda. In a final effort to save Idi Amin, Libya issued an ultimatum to Tanzania on 25 March 1979, stating that if Tanzania did not withdraw from Uganda, Libya would declare war on it. But Julius Nyerere refused to comply. The ultimatum from Gaddafi actually surprised Julius Nyerere, since he knew that Libyan officers had fought alongside the Ugandans at the Battle of Lukaya, a town in Uganda. Here at Lukaya, the biggest battle of the Kagera War took place when the Ugandan rebels and Tanzanians defeated a joint Ugandan-Palestinian-Libyan force. Subsequently, Julius Nyerere made a radio broadcast where he declared that while Gaddafi's threat added other dimensions to the Kagera War, it didn't change Tanzania's view of Idi Amin. 4 days later, in a bid to frighten Julius Nyerere, Gaddafi ordered a Tupolev Tu-28 bomber to attack a gas depot in Mwanza, Tanzania. This bomber failed to hit its target and instead hit a game reserve. Tanzanian jets retaliated by hitting fuel depots in Tororo, Kampala, and Jinja, all in Uganda. As the Ugandan army was facing inevitable defeat, Julius Nyerere feared that scenes of the Tanzanian soldiers entering Kampala in triumph would damage Tanzania's public image, and so, like I mentioned, Nyerere had hoped that the anti-Amin Ugandan exiles would be able to seize the capital themselves. With this in mind, Tanzania responded by unifying the exiled rebels against Idi Amin's government in April of 1979, and with the aid of the Tanzanian army and Yoweri Museveni's Fronasa, they overthrew Idi Amin. The following is an account of the events of April of 1979 from the point of view of Idi Amin's son, Jafar Amin. Here it goes. In early April of 1979, as the invading troops prepared to move into Kampala, Idi Amin himself fled the capital with some of his family members. Idi Amin had himself declared in a radio broadcast on 6 April that he would never leave the country, whatever happened. According to his son, Idi Amin was being stubborn in the face of defeat and had to be forcibly restrained and taken to safety by his presidential guard. It is said that the presidential guard actually immobilized him with straps and placed him in his car. The story goes that on the 11th of April 1979, when his government was overthrown, Idi Amin wanted to die in battle like a true soldier, but several of his presidential guards would not let him. His convoy then set off in a row for Jinja, where Idi Amin made an emotional speech before heading to the West Nile region. According to Jafar Amin, on 23 April, a Libyan transport plane landed and took his father into exile as his former soldiers fired aimlessly at nothing, and thousands of people from the West Nile region, who were aware that they were seen as Idi Amin's people, scrambled to get over the border to neighboring countries. The Tanzanian forces continued to push the remnants of the Ugandan army towards West Nile. When they reached the region, they unleashed atrocities quite up to the high standards set by the ex-president Idi Amin himself, forcing virtually all the local population into Sudan and Zaire, which is now the DRC. After escaping first to Libya, Amin finally settled in Saudi Arabia, where he lived until his death in 2003. The Kagera War had a detrimental effect on all the parties involved. The war cost Tanzania $500 million and 373 soldiers. The Kagera War also seriously harmed Tanzania's weak economy and wreaked long-lasting damage to Kagera. The war also had adverse economic effects in Uganda and brought about a wave of political violence and crime as the new government tried to maintain order. The rough estimate of Idi Amin's casualties, including the Libyans who fought on Uganda's side, was about 1,600 men. Additionally, Tanzania lost approximately 1,500 civilians in the Kagera salient, and about 500 Ugandan civilians were killed accidentally or intentionally by both sides during the course of the war. It is worth mentioning that in the weeks prior to the fall of Kampala, Ugandan exiles had formed an organization called the Ugandan National Liberation Front. Members of this organization became the new government of Uganda once Idi Amin had been deposed, and a teacher by the name Yusuf Lule was appointed as the president of Uganda. But post-Amin Uganda turned out to be politically unstable, and Yusuf Lule was replaced as president by former Ugandan Attorney General Godfrey Binaisa. Binaisa was himself ousted from the presidency after less than a year. Apollo Milton Obote won the following 1980 general election, but the soldier-cum-politician Yoweri Museveni, who is the current leader of Uganda, refused to accept the result and started the Ugandan Bush War, which ravaged Uganda. I will touch on the Ugandan Civil War and the rise of Yoweri Museveni in another video in the future. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.